Welcome to Diplomacy and International Relations by Bastian Freiburg. Quick note before we get going, this episode is AI generated, but Bastian's given it the okay.
Yep, that's right. Think of it as AI lending a hand to bring you these deep dives.
And today we are diving deep into something pretty fascinating, Bastian's master's thesis from 2016. It's all about how Christianity, played a role in shaping German migration policy back during the 2015-2016 refugee crisis. And you might be thinking, why bring this up now? Well, the thing is, these themes that Bastian explored, migration, national identity, how religious values influence policy, it's all more relevant now than ever.
Absolutely, these issues are still front-page news, sparking debates shaping the world around us.
Exactly. So let's rewind back to 2015-2016. Europe facing a massive influx of refugees, mainly from Syria, a war-torn country. It was a crisis that really tested the continent's values and resources.
And Germany, with Angela Merkel at the helm, they took a really bold stance. Open borders, welcoming refugees. They even waived the Dublin Protocol, which, normally dictates where asylum seekers should apply.
So Germany was essentially saying, we're stepping up, we'll shoulder a big part of this responsibility, and it was a decision that made headlines globally. Now, Bastian's thesis really digs into what might have motivated this open-door policy, and one of the things he looks at is Germany's own history with refugees.
Think about it. Post-World War II, the fall of the Berlin Wall, Germany had been on both sides of the refugee experience. They knew what it meant to seek refuge and to offer it.
Right, they'd walked in those shoes. So Bastian asks, did this shared experience shape their response in 2015? Did it create a sense of empathy, a moral obligation to help?
That's a question worth exploring, isn't it? And this is where it gets really interesting. Bastian's thesis looks at two very different ways of interpreting Christian values at play during this crisis. He calls them the Good Samaritan approach and protective Christianity.
Okay, let's break those down. The Good Samaritan approach, this was championed by figures like Pope Francis, right?
Exactly. It's about compassion, about extending a helping hand, about welcoming those who are struggling. And it aligns with this concept of human security, which puts the well-being of people front and center.
So it's about prioritizing human dignity and safety above all else. But then there's this other side, protective Christianity.
Yeah, and as the name kind of implies, this view is more about protecting national identity, protecting one's own culture and values, especially when there's a perceived threat from other cultures. And in this case, the perceived threat was largely focused on Islam.
So you have this tension within Christianity itself, playing out on a global stage.
A fascinating dynamic, right? And right in the middle of all this, you have Angela Merkel. Her actions during the crisis, which she described as driven by, a moral imperative, earned her praise globally. But those same actions also sparked some pretty heated debates within Germany itself.
Tough spot to be in. Makes you wonder, was her stance purely based on her personal faith, or was there some political strategy at play as well? After all, she was part of the Christian Democratic Union Party.
It's a question Bastian digs into in his thesis. He looks at both the moral and the political dimensions of Merkel's leadership, recognizing that it's rarely black and white.
And speaking of complexities, how did the German public react during all this? Initially, there was this incredible outpouring of support for the refugees. People volunteering, donating resources. It was inspiring.
It was a remarkable display of solidarity. But as the crisis went on, that initial wave of sympathy, it began to shift. We saw anxiety about Islamization growing, and this was reflected in the rising popularity of those anti-immigration groups like Pegida and AfD.
It's a pattern that seems to repeat itself throughout history. Initial compassion then gives way to uncertainty, even fear as things unfold, especially when different cultures and religions are involved.
It's a complex human reaction, often fueled by a lack of understanding or familiarity. And sadly, some groups, they exploit those fears for political gain.
Absolutely. And in this case, there was one event that really intensified anxieties, the Cologne New Year's Eve assaults.
Oh, that was a turning point for sure. Those assaults, they dramatically increased fear, fueled anti-immigrant sentiment across Germany. It shifted the public discourse significantly.
So how did all of this actually impact policy? Did those shifting public attitudes, combined with political pressures, force the German government to change course?
They did. Germany started tightening its asylum rules. The process got stricter, benefits were limited, and it became easier to deport applicants whose claims were rejected.
So a move away from that initial open-door approach. What about efforts to, integrate the refugees who were already in Germany? I'm thinking of things like the German Islam Conference, which aimed to bridge cultural and religious divides.
You're right. Germany was grappling with this massive challenge: how to help newcomers find a place in society. But as you can imagine, there were obstacles. It's not easy to bridge cultural and religious differences, especially amidst anxieties and political pressures.
And this was all happening as Merkel's own party, the CDU, was experiencing internal conflict, right?
Hmm.
Some members backed her compassionate stance, while others wanted stricter controls on refugee numbers.
Exactly. A really difficult situation. With competing viewpoints and tension within the party itself, it shows just how complex these issues are. You've got public opinion, political maneuvering, deeply held religious values, and practical considerations all colliding. A perfect example of why understanding international relations requires looking beyond the surface and grappling with these nuances.
You hit the nail on the head. It's rarely simple, is it? But that's what makes these deep dives so fascinating. Peeling back the layers, exploring the intricate things that shape global events. We've covered a lot, but there's still more to unpack. Let's dive deeper into Bastion's analysis and explore how Christianity specifically influenced Angela Merkel's decision-making during this critical period. We've talked about the big picture, historical context, clashing values, but what about the people on the ground, the ones making those tough calls about, well, who gets asylum and who doesn't? I'm thinking about the Federal Office for Migration and Refugees, BAMF, I think it's called.
Ah, yeah, BAMF. They were right in the thick of it, weren't they? Imagine the weight of those decisions, the sheer volume of applications they had to process. Bastian, actually, a good chunk of his thesis is analyzing how BAM handled this really complex situation.
What did he find? Were they able to keep up with those humanitarian ideals that Germany initially embraced? Or did the pressure cooker of public opinion, the political realities, did that force them to compromise?
Well, it was a constant balancing act, as you can imagine. Bastian's research shows that BAM was deeply committed to helping genuine refugees. But, they were also very aware of the need to keep things orderly, to address those rising anxieties we talked about earlier.
So how did that play out in their day-to-day work? What kind of changes did they make to the asylum process?
One key thing they did was introduce a more extensive list of safe countries of origin. The idea was that if someone came from a country considered safe, their asylum claim was, well, less likely to be legitimate.
That makes sense, I guess. Trying to, prioritize resources for those fleeing the most dangerous situations. But how did they decide which countries were safe? That seems kind of subjective.
Yeah, you're right. It was definitely a point of contention. The criteria, they weren't always crystal clear, and there were criticisms that some countries were labeled safe too quickly, potentially putting people at risk if they were sent back.
So well-intentioned, but maybe not without its flaws. Any other significant changes to the asylum process?
They did. They raised the age for applying for asylum independently from 16 to 18, meaning more young people had to go through the process with their families, which, could complicate things. They also put restrictions on employment for new asylum seekers.
Now that one seems a bit counterintuitive. Wouldn't letting them work help them integrate faster, become self-sufficient?
You'd think so, right? But remember, the government was under a lot of pressure from those who worried about, refugees taking jobs away from German citizens. So it was a concession, a way to appease those concerns, even if it might have slowed down integration in the long run.
It's that constant push and pull between humanitarian impulses
Yeah.
and the political realities, right? And then you had those Cologne attacks, which I imagine threw another wrench in the works.
Oh, absolutely. After Cologne, there was a very deliberate shift towards, tightening security and strengthening deportation procedures. Bastian's research shows that quite clearly.
Understandable, given the heightened fear, the need to reassure the public. But deportations they're tricky, aren't they? Especially when you're talking about sending people back to potentially dangerous places.
You've hit on a key ethical dilemma that Bastian wrestles with in his thesis. How do you balance protecting your own citizens with upholding international law, like the Refugee Convention, which says you can't send refugees back to places where they could face persecution?
Heavy stuff, no easy answers. Seems like every decision had these ripple effects touching on ethics, legalities, politics.
Exactly. It shows just how intertwined these issues are. You can't discuss migration policy without talking about human rights, national security, cultural identity, even religious values.
Now, beyond the immediate crisis management, Bastian also looks at the longer-term challenge, right?
Yeah.
Integration. How Germany was trying to incorporate this wave of newcomers into society. This feels really relevant today as countries around the world are dealing with similar questions.
Yeah, an issue that's not going away anytime soon. And like you said, it's not just about paperwork and basic needs. True integration means creating a sense of belonging, fostering understanding, addressing those deeper anxieties around cultural and religious differences.
So what were some of the approaches Germany was taking? Do they have like specific programs or initiatives aimed at integration?
One of the biggest was the German Islam Conference, a platform for dialogue between the government and representatives of Muslim communities in Germany.
Sounds promising. A
Yeah.
space for like open conversation, building bridges. What kind of topics did they discuss?
Oh, a broad range. Religious freedom, social integration, education, even combating extremism. It was an attempt to address both the practical challenges and those, deeper anxieties about integrating Muslims into German society.
A multifaceted approach, recognizing that integration is complex with many layers. Were there any concrete outcomes from these conferences? Did they lead to any like tangible changes in policy or how things were done?
Well, it's tough to measure the exact impact of a dialogue platform like this, right? But it did lead to some concrete actions, like increased funding for projects focused on social integration, helping immigrants learn German, find jobs, navigate daily life in their new home.
So a mix of top-down dialogue and grassroots support, recognizing that successful integration takes effort from both sides.
Exactly. But as Bastian points out, it's a process that's always going to be affected by the bigger political and social context. And in this case, well, that context was incredibly charged. Anxieties about national identity, Islamophobia, cultural clashes all swirling around.
A real pressure cooker, as we've said. And right in the center of it all was Angela Merkel, trying to navigate those competing pressures, guided, at least in part, by her own deep Christian faith.
It is fascinating how her faith played into her decision-making. Some praised her for, her moral leadership, while others criticized her for being too idealistic, too willing to risk Germany's stability for humanitarian principles.
And within her own party, the CDU, she faced pushback, right? From those who felt she went too far, hadn't thought enough about the consequences of opening the border so wide. Must have been incredibly tough to stand her ground amidst all that.
Oh, it was a test of her leadership, without a doubt. And it's a reminder that even in a secular state like Germany, religious values can have a huge impact on political decisions, especially in times of crisis.
And on that note, let's dig a bit deeper into how Merkel specifically used religious language, religious imagery to frame her arguments, and how that resonated with the German public. We'll explore that really interesting aspect of Bastian's research after a quick break. We've talked about the pressures Merkel faced, that balancing act of policy, but let's zoom in on her rhetoric for a second. Here she was, leading a secular state, but often framing her response to the refugee crisis in very moral, even religious terms.
Yeah, it's kind of striking, isn't it? Germany with that history of separating church and state, and suddenly you have a leader invoking Christian values on the world stage. And remember, Merkel herself, she came from that Christian democratic background, so her faith wasn't just some, abstract idea.
Makes you wonder, was she consciously using her faith to, like, guide her decisions? Or was it more about connecting with a shared sense of values among Germans? Maybe a bit of both.
Well, Bastian argues it was probably a mix of things. Personally, Merkel genuinely seemed to believe that Germany had a moral obligation to help these refugees, an obligation rooted in, those Christian teachings of compassion and charity.
Like that Good Samaritan approach we talked about, seeing the humanity in others no matter their background.
Right, and she didn't shy away from using that imagery. Some of her speeches, she directly referenced the parable of the Good Samaritan, urging Germans to see refugees not as strangers, but as neighbors in need.
Powerful stuff. I can see how that would resonate with a lot of Germans, especially those who shared her faith. But as things got more complicated, as those anxieties about, national identity and cultural differences grew, did that religious framing become a bit of a problem?
It definitely added another layer of complexity because as we've seen, those same Christian values, they could be used to support the opposite viewpoint. The idea of protecting German culture, which is, rooted in Christianity, from outside influences.
So Merkel's use of religious language was, in a way, a gamble. It could inspire compassion, but it could also be kind of turned against her, used to fuel the very anxieties she was trying to address.
Exactly. And it really shows her conviction that she didn't back down from that language even when the political climate was changing. She kept arguing that Germany's response reflected its values, its identity as a nation with a moral compass.
It takes courage to stick to your principles when they're not popular. And while her stance, stirred up debate within Germany, it did gain her a lot of admiration globally.
She was seen as this moral leader, someone willing to stand up for what she believed in, even when it was tough. And it's interesting how this played into Germany's role in the world. Here's a nation that, for much of the 20th century, was dealing with the legacy of its own, dark past.
Right, trying to rebuild its image, atone for the sins of the Nazi era.
Hmm.
And now, under Merkel's leadership, they were stepping forward as a champion of human rights, defending the vulnerable. It was a big shift.
Yeah, you could call it a redemption arc. And it was a powerful example of how faith, even in a secular context, can shape political decisions and influence a nation's role on the world stage.
It's a reminder that these issues, migration, national identity, the role of religion, they're not just abstract concepts. They're tied to personal values, to people's experiences, to the choices leaders make.
Absolutely. And to Bastian's thesis, by exploring those connections in such a nuanced way, it gives us valuable insights into this complex world we live in. It encourages us to think critically, to grapple with those gray areas where easy answers don't really exist.
It's been a fascinating deep dive, wouldn't you say? We've explored history, policy, religion, even touched on the very essence of leadership. And while we've covered a lot, Bastian's work leaves us with plenty to think about.
It does. These questions about, balancing humanitarian impulses with national interests, navigating cultural and religious differences in a world that's increasingly interconnected, these are questions that will continue to challenge us for years to come.
And that, I think, is the beauty of a deep dive like this. It's not about easy answers, but about sparking curiosity, encouraging us to keep exploring these complex issues, keep asking those tough questions.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And on that note, we'll wrap up our exploration of Bastian Friborg's insightful thesis. Hope you found it thought-provoking. Until next time, keep diving.